You stopped chasing validation. You stopped over-explaining your worth. You stopped begging for consistency from inconsistency. You started embodying calm certainty instead of emotional chaos. You became someone who chooses themselves even when love feels uncertain. You didn't win them by trying harder. You earned their respect by no longer needing their approval. There is a moment in emotional dynamics that most people never recognize. A silent shift where pursuit ends and presence begins. Where desperation dissolves and dignity takes its place. And in that space, something unexpected happens. The one who once pulled away starts to pause, starts to notice, starts to respect. But here is the truth most people will not tell you. This shift is not about them changing. It is about you remembering who you are. You were not meant to chase love that requires you to abandon yourself. You were not meant to shrink your truth just to stay connected to someone who only meets you halfway. You were meant to stand in emotional integrity so strong that even distance can no longer distort your worth. Because when you stop reacting, when you stop overgiving, when you stop trying to prove your value to someone emotionally inconsistent, you do something powerful. You become unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity is what disrupts avoidance. Avoidant energy is not moved by pressure. It is not softened by pleading. It is not healed by over-explanation. It is only met by calm presence that does not collapse under silence. When you stop chasing, they are forced to face something they have been avoiding all along, the reality of your stability without their control. And that is where respect begins. Not because they suddenly become emotionally perfect, but because you are no longer available for emotional confusion. You begin to communicate in a new language. The language of boundaries without anger. The language of love without self-abandonment. The language of connection without dependency. And in that language, something profound happens. You are no longer perceived as someone trying to be chosen. You are perceived as someone who has already chosen themselves. But this path is not for everyone, because many will confuse silence for rejection. Many will mistake detachment for loss. Many will return to old patterns the moment discomfort appears. But those who stay grounded, those who remain centered when love feels uncertain, those who refuse to lose themselves just to keep someone close, they step into a different reality. A reality where love is no longer a negotiation, where attention is no longer begged for, where respect is no longer requested. It is given naturally, because your energy no longer allows anything less. And if you are waiting for a sign that you are on the right path, here it is. The moment you no longer need to prove your worth is the moment your worth becomes undeniable. Not because they finally see you differently, but because you finally stop seeing yourself as optional. And in that stillness, in that quiet strength, something shifts. They may not say it, they may not fully understand it, but they feel it. The version of you that once tolerated confusion is gone, and in its place stands someone who is no longer available for half love, half effort, or half presence. That is not distance. That is self-respect. And it is the reason you are no longer chasing anything. Because what is meant for you no longer requires pursuit. You stopped chasing validation, and that shift is far deeper than most people realize. It is not just about stepping back from a person, a relationship, or a situation. It is about stepping out of an identity that was built on emotional dependency. For a long time, you may have believed that love, attention, or consistency had to be earned through effort, through patience, through overgiving, or through proving your worth repeatedly. So you adjusted yourself. You became more available than you needed to be. You explained yourself more than necessary. You tolerated inconsistencies, hoping that clarity would eventually arrive if you just stayed long enough, cared long enough, or gave enough. But something inside you began to awaken, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. You started noticing that the more you chased clarity, the more it seemed to slip away. The more you tried to secure someone's presence, the more unstable your own energy became. And in that awareness, a sacred realization started forming. You were not actually being chosen or rejected by others as much as you were participating in a cycle where your own validation was placed outside of yourself. Stopping the chase is not an act of indifference. It is an act of returning to your center. It is the moment you realize that your emotional stability cannot depend on unpredictable access to someone else's attention. Because when your sense of worth is tied to external response, every silence becomes rejection, every delay becomes anxiety, and every inconsistency becomes a reason to try harder instead of step back. But when you stop chasing validation, something profound begins to unfold within you. You begin to observe instead of react. You begin to witness instead of attach. You begin to feel your own presence again, without constantly measuring it through someone else's behavior. And slowly, the emotional urgency that once controlled your decisions starts to dissolve. You no longer rush to fix misunderstandings that were never yours to carry alone. You no longer overextend yourself to maintain connections that require you to abandon your own needs. You no longer confuse effort with self-sacrifice. This is not detachment born from bitterness. It is clarity born from exhaustion turning into wisdom. You start to understand that real connection does not require you to shrink yourself, nor does it require you to constantly question your value. And in that understanding, you begin to reclaim something that was always yours but often misplaced: your emotional authority. There is a subtle power in no longer needing immediate reassurance. When you stop chasing validation, your energy changes. You are no longer communicating from lack, but from presence. You are no longer asking, "Am I enough?" because that question loses its grip when you stop outsourcing the answer. Instead, your inner state begins to stabilize, regardless of external feedback. You can sit in silence without interpreting it as abandonment. You can experience distance without turning it into self-doubt. You can allow space without rushing to fill it. And paradoxically, this is often the point where dynamics begin to shift. Not because you are trying to influence them, but because you are no longer destabilized by them. What once pulled you into overthinking no longer has access to your emotional center. What once triggered urgency now meets stillness. And in that stillness, your presence becomes something different. No longer needy, no longer desperate, but grounded and self-contained. You are no longer performing for connection. You are simply existing within it. And that existence, that quiet certainty, carries a weight that does not require explanation. It is felt, and more importantly, it is respected, not because you demanded it, but because you no longer function without it from yourself. You stopped over-explaining your worth, and in that decision, you quietly broke one of the most draining emotional patterns a person can live inside. Over-explaining is rarely about communication. It is about fear. It is the fear that if you don't say enough, clarify enough, justify enough, or soften your truth enough, then you will be misunderstood, misjudged, or discarded. So you begin to stretch your words further than necessary. You add layers to things that were already simple. You defend intentions that never needed defense. You keep speaking, even when silence would have protected your peace better than explanation ever could. At first, it feels responsible. It feels like maturity. It feels like you are doing your part to keep understanding alive. But slowly, something begins to shift within you. You start noticing that no matter how much you explain, some people do not listen to understand. They listen to respond. And worse, some do not even listen at all. They simply wait for a pause so they can hold on to their existing perception of you. In that moment, your words stop being bridges and start becoming burdens. You are no longer communicating. You are negotiating your own existence in someone else's mind. And that is where exhaustion quietly enters. Because over-explaining is not just verbal, it is emotional labor. It is the constant attempt to manage how you are perceived, as if your worth depends on being correctly interpreted at all times. You begin to feel responsible for other people's misunderstandings. You start believing that if they are distant, confused, or inconsistent, it must be because you did not explain yourself well enough. So you try again, and again, and again, until your inner world becomes louder than your actual life. But there is a moment of awakening that changes everything. It does not come from being heard. It comes from realizing that being understood was never guaranteed by explanation alone. Some people are not confused about you. They are committed to their version of you. And no amount of clarification can reach someone who is not open to seeing differently. This is not a reflection of your inadequacy. It is a reflection of their capacity. When you stop over-explaining your worth, you begin to reclaim your energy from places it was never meant to go. You stop trying to convince people of your intentions. You stop rewriting your truth to make it more digestible. You stop softening your boundaries just to avoid discomfort in others. And in doing so, something powerful begins to settle within you. Silence becomes complete. Not empty, but complete. You start realizing that your presence does not require constant justification. Your choices do not need endless approval. Your boundaries do not need emotional court hearings. You are allowed to simply be without defending every layer of your being. And this is where emotional maturity begins to deepen, not in how well you explain yourself, but in how little you feel the need to. There is a quiet dignity in no longer chasing understanding from those who benefit from misunderstanding you, because over-explaining often places you in a position where you are unconsciously asking for permission to exist as you are. And when that pattern dissolves, you begin to stand in a different kind of energy, one that is not trying to be accepted, but is already anchored in self-acceptance. You also begin to notice something subtle in your relationships. The right connections do not require endless clarification. They make space for your presence without forcing you to constantly define it. They do not punish your silence or weaponize your words. They allow you to breathe without turning every breath into a debate. And in contrast, the wrong dynamics become easier to see. You recognize where you were performing emotional labor just to maintain access. You see where your explanations were not building closeness, but draining your inner closeness. And in that clarity, you begin to step back, not with anger, but with awareness. Because when you stop over-explaining your worth, you stop participating in relationships where your value must be constantly argued for. And that shift changes everything. You begin to speak less, but mean more. You begin to respond instead of react. You begin to choose words that preserve your peace instead of sacrificing it. And slowly, you realize something deeply grounding. The people meant for you do not need you to convince them to stay. You stopped begging for consistency from inconsistency, and that moment marks a quiet but irreversible shift in your inner world. Because inconsistency is not just a behavior, it is an emotional pattern that creates instability in your nervous system when you try to build safety inside it. For a long time, you may have believed that if you just stayed patient enough, understanding enough, forgiving enough, or flexible enough, the pattern would eventually settle. You kept interpreting mixed signals as something temporary, something fixable, something that would make sense if you could just wait a little longer. So you adjusted yourself around unpredictability. You learned how to read between silence and attention. You became fluent in emotional guesswork. One day there is warmth, the next there is distance. One moment there is presence, the next there is absence. And instead of stepping away from the instability, you started adapting to it, as if your emotional balance could be trained to tolerate confusion indefinitely. You began filling in the gaps with hope, assuming that consistency would eventually emerge if you proved yourself steady enough within their instability, but something deeper within you eventually began to resist that pattern. Because the human spirit, when it is not overridden by fear, naturally seeks coherence. It seeks emotional safety that does not fluctuate based on someone else's mood, availability, or internal conflict. And when you stay too long in inconsistency, you begin to realize that what you are calling love is often just intermittent reinforcement, a cycle where unpredictable attention keeps you emotionally hooked while never fully grounding you. Stopping the act of begging for consistency is not coldness. It is clarity returning. It is the recognition that you cannot build emotional peace on shifting ground. You cannot create stability from someone who is not stable within themselves. And more importantly, you cannot sacrifice your own internal balance just to remain available for moments of clarity that arrive unpredictably. There is a point where your energy becomes tired, not just emotionally, but spiritually tired of interpreting confusion as potential. You begin to see that consistency is not something you should have to extract, request, or negotiate. It is something that either exists or does not. And when it does not, no amount of effort on your part will manufacture it into being. When you stop begging for consistency from inconsistency, your perception begins to sharpen. You stop romanticizing the good moments as evidence of hidden depth. You stop using rare clarity as justification for ongoing confusion. You begin to evaluate connection not by intensity, but by reliability. And in that shift, many things you once tolerated begin to lose their emotional grip on you. This is where emotional detachment begins to form, not from indifference, but from honesty. You start to see that inconsistency creates a cycle where you are constantly recalibrating your expectations just to stay emotionally connected. You begin to recognize how much of your inner peace was being traded for temporary moments of reassurance. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. There is also a deeper spiritual awakening that happens in this stage. You realize that your energy was never meant to be fragmented in response to someone else's unpredictability. Your attention, your focus, your emotional stability, these are not meant to be scattered across confusion. They are meant to be anchored within you. And every time you return to inconsistency, you leave yourself again. So you begin to withdraw, not as punishment, not as strategy, but as preservation. You start choosing clarity over attachment. You start valuing peace over potential. You start realizing that love that destabilizes you is not love that can sustain you. And slowly, something within you settles into a new rhythm. You no longer chase the next moment of clarity. You no longer wait for the next emotional high to justify staying. You no longer measure connection by how strongly it pulls you in, but by how safely it holds you. Because at a deeper level, you understand now that consistency is not something you earn by enduring inconsistency. It is something you align with by no longer participating in what fractures your inner peace. You became someone who chooses themselves even when love feels uncertain, and that is not a small emotional adjustment. It is a full reorientation of your inner compass. Because uncertainty in love has a way of pulling people outward, away from themselves, into constant scanning, analyzing, waiting, hoping, and trying to decode what is not being clearly given. In that space, many people begin to abandon themselves slowly, almost invisibly. They start prioritizing emotional access over emotional alignment. They start valuing presence over peace. They start staying in situations that require them to shrink just to remain included. But something in you reached a threshold, a point where uncertainty stopped feeling like mystery and started feeling like erosion. And in that moment, the shift began, not as a dramatic exit, but as a quiet return inward. Choosing yourself in the middle of emotional uncertainty is not about rejecting love. It is about refusing to lose yourself inside it. It is the realization that love, no matter how compelling, cannot be the place where your identity dissolves. For a long time, you may have believed that choosing yourself meant walking away, but deeper understanding reveals something more refined. Choosing yourself is not always about leaving people. It is about no longer leaving yourself while staying with them. It is about no longer abandoning your needs, your clarity, your emotional stability, just to keep connection alive. It is about no longer negotiating your worth in exchange for proximity. When love feels uncertain, the mind naturally wants resolution. It wants answers, definitions, commitments, guarantees. And when those are not provided, it often tries to create stability through effort, more patience, more understanding, more accommodation. But emotional uncertainty does not respond to increased effort from one side. It only deepens the imbalance. And in that imbalance, you begin to realize that your effort is not producing clarity. It is only sustaining confusion. Choosing yourself becomes the moment you stop trying to fix what requires mutual willingness. You stop interpreting emotional distance as a challenge to overcome. You stop seeing inconsistency as something your love can correct. Instead, you begin to see it for what it is: information. Information about capacity, availability, emotional readiness, and alignment. And in that clarity, something powerful begins to happen internally. You start to detach your worth from the outcome of uncertain situations. You stop measuring your value by whether someone chooses you fully, partially, or inconsistently. You begin to understand that your value is not confirmed through selection. It is expressed through self-respect. This does not mean you become emotionally closed. It means you become emotionally anchored. You can still feel deeply without losing yourself in the feeling. You can still care without collapsing into attachment. You can still love without turning that love into self-sacrifice. There is a subtle but profound difference between waiting to be chosen and choosing yourself first. When you wait, your energy becomes suspended in possibility. You become reactive to every shift, every silence, every change in tone. But when you choose yourself, your energy becomes grounded. You are no longer living in response to someone else's emotional availability. You are living in alignment with your own internal stability. And in that state, uncertainty loses its control over you. It may still exist externally, but it no longer defines your internal world. You are no longer reorganizing your peace around unpredictability. You are no longer building emotional homes in spaces that do not offer stability. Instead, you begin to recognize that true connection does not require you to question your place in it repeatedly. Choosing yourself in uncertainty also means accepting that clarity is not something you force, it is something you observe. If someone is unsure, inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable, you no longer interpret it as something you must resolve through endurance. You allow it to be what it is, without turning it into a personal challenge. And in that acceptance, you regain something sacred: emotional self-trust. You begin to trust your own perception again. You stop overriding your inner discomfort to maintain outer connection. You stop ignoring the signals your body and intuition have been sending for a long time. Over time, this becomes your new foundation. Not the need to be chosen, but the decision to no longer abandon yourself while waiting for it. And from that foundation, something quietly transformative emerges. You no longer approach love as something that must be secured at the cost of your peace. You approach it as something that must meet you where you already stand. You were meant to stand in emotional integrity so strong that even distance can no longer distort your worth. And this is where everything you have experienced begins to reorganize itself into a higher understanding. Emotional integrity is not about perfection. It is not about never feeling doubt, never feeling attachment, or never feeling the pull of someone who is inconsistent. It is about what you do with those feelings. It is about whether you allow those feelings to override your self-respect or whether you hold your ground even while feeling them. For most people, distance becomes a measurement of value. If someone pulls away, the mind instinctively begins to question worth. If someone becomes less available, the heart begins to chase resolution. If someone withdraws, the nervous system begins to interpret absence as rejection. But emotional integrity begins where these automatic reactions are no longer in control of your decisions. It is the point where distance stops being a verdict on your value and starts being neutral, information about availability. When you stand in emotional integrity, you are no longer negotiating your worth with someone's presence or absence. You are no longer interpreting silence as something that defines you. You begin to understand that distance is not a reflection of your inadequacy, but often a reflection of someone else's capacity, readiness, or emotional structure. And this understanding creates a profound shift in how you relate to connection itself. There is a quiet strength in not collapsing inward when someone pulls away, because collapse is what happens when your sense of self is still tied to external validation. Emotional integrity is the refusal to collapse. It is the ability to remain internally aligned even when externally things feel uncertain. You do not chase to restore balance. You do not overextend to repair distance. You do not distort yourself to close emotional gaps that were never yours alone to bridge. Instead, you begin to hold a steady center. You allow people to be where they are without abandoning where you are. And this creates a kind of presence that is deeply grounded, not rigid, not detached in a cold sense, but anchored. You are no longer easily pulled into emotional chaos because you are no longer building your identity inside someone else's fluctuating behavior. This is where your self-worth begins to stabilize in a way that is no longer dependent on external consistency. You realize that your value does not expand when someone is close, nor does it shrink when they are distant. It remains constant. What changes is not your worth, but your access to situations that reflect it clearly. Emotional integrity also means you stop participating in dynamics where you must repeatedly prove your place. You stop entering cycles where your presence is conditional on your adaptability to inconsistency. You begin to recognize that love, which requires you to repeatedly question your value, is not love that is aligned with your stability. And so you begin to step out of patterns where distance is used, consciously or unconsciously, as a tool that destabilizes your emotional center. There is also a deeper internal transformation that happens here. You stop reacting to distance with urgency. You stop interpreting it as something that must be fixed immediately. You begin to allow space without fear. And in that space, something remarkable happens. You start to hear your own inner voice again, separate from emotional noise. Because when you are constantly reacting to closeness and distance, your inner voice becomes drowned out by external fluctuation. But emotional integrity brings you back to yourself. It restores your ability to feel your own clarity without interference. You begin to know what feels aligned without needing confirmation from someone who is inconsistent. And over time, this becomes your natural state. You no longer need to perform emotional survival strategies just to feel secure. You no longer measure your worth through proximity. You no longer allow distance to rewrite your identity. Instead, you stand in a place where your value is internally anchored, and therefore unshaken by external movement. Even when someone steps back, you do not step down from yourself. Even when connection becomes uncertain, your self-respect does not become negotiable. Even when silence enters, your identity does not dissolve into it. This is emotional integrity, not as an idea, but as a lived state of being, where your worth is no longer something that can be altered by someone else's distance. Thank you for being here and engaging with this message so deeply. Goodbye for now, and may you carry this clarity with you into everything ahead.